As we all know, our human family is going through some crazy times right now. A lot of darkness in the world, a lot of pain in the world. People are struggling, people are suffering, people are figuring out how do we handle this. They're struggling with the sense of frustration, of hopelessness, of pain, of helplessness, of anger, of rage at the injustice, rage at the violence, rage at the racism, rage at the brutality, rage at man's inhumanity to man, and trying to figure out, what do we do about this? How do we actually create long-lasting behavior change moving forward from these awful things that have happened and what we've been witness to? How do we actually change this? Because what happened to George Floyd is not the first time that's happened. It's not the first time. We want it to be the last. So how do we make that happen? So I've been working hard to do a lot of research into the forces of creating behavior change and into addressing this and of offering some solutions that will make a difference. The solutions that will help actually head us on this path to putting an end to this kind of brutality, to putting an end to racism. And I mean, by no means do I have all the answers to putting an end to racism. I mean, that's a daunting battle. It's a battle that's been going on since the beginning of the human condition, right? So it's not a battle that I claim to have all the answers to, but it's a battle worth fighting and dying for. Not just racism, but man's inhumanity to man, the violence, the injustice, the brutality of our nature, and figuring out a better path. So I'm working on an in-depth article to attempt to offer some solutions based on not just a lot of research, but living it. I mean, experiencing it within and without, from having worked in leper colonies to volunteering with those struggling with extreme poverty, to helping victims of sex trafficking, to former child soldiers, to being in a war zone and battling my own demons, to really having explored the edges of the human experience to understand the nature of the human condition, the nature of the human consciousness, of the human soul. And so from that place, how do we move forward? Now, I'm going to share a lot more details in this article, but I thought I'd at least share a little bit about what I believe are the forces that need to be addressed and at least offer some step in some action step to take us down this path of change. So the way I see it, there's change that really needs to happen at two levels, right? There's the systemic institutional change that needs to happen, which clearly needs to happen. Clearly, you can't really argue that. I mean, from what I understand, Derek Chauvin had 18 complaints filed against him. So creating systemic and institutional changes that allow for racism, allow for brutality, allow for violence, allow for injustice to happen. But I am no expert at that. There's far wiser people than myself to address changes at that level, at the institutional level, at the systemic level. So where I have some experience and some knowledge from life experience, from research, from exploring the human condition at all its edges, is the other area that changed. So there's a top-down change that needs to happen, and the other change is the grassroots level, the bottom-up. Change from the individual consciousness to the collective consciousness to then leading to the systemic, the institutional change. Now, both changes ideally should be occurring at the same time, with top-down and bottom-up. So it's not just one or the other. But focusing now where I believe I have some thoughts to offer, again, not claiming to by any stretch of the imagination to have all the answers, but some thoughts on where we can move forward in an empowering way to combat this violence and brutality and racism. So under the umbrella of this conscious change, how do we address it? So what are we fundamentally doing firstly? Fundamentally, what we're doing, if we want to solve racism, solve violence, or any kind of problem, is to create behavior change. That's what we're doing. At the meta level, at the highest level, what we are doing is creating behavior change. So in order to do that, we got to understand the process of behavior change. How does one create behavior change? So let's look at behavior change from the individual level and apply the analogies to the collective, because they, without a doubt, do apply. So at the individual level, what is it that creates what is it that leads to behavior change? The strongest driver for behavior change, the biggest driver for behavior change, is pain. Pain is ultimately the only true driver of change. So pain happens. I can give you an example. My own life is, when I was diagnosed with PTSD, struggling with depression, drinking a bottle of vodka a day and was on the verge of suicide, going through some pain. So pain leads to the initiator of change. Now what usually happens? This is not to say people don't change, and not to say that times haven't changed if we apply the same lens to the collective, which I'm about to get to. And that's another thing I want to get to real quick on this. I've seen people say this argument that, we're way better off than we were 50 years ago. Yeah, we may be way better off than we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but that doesn't mean there's not a problem right now that needs to be addressed. It's silly to kind of say, just because we're way better off, that doesn't mean there's clearly not a problem. And I've seen people address this argument, which is why it came to mind and I wanted to point it out, is that there's clearly a problem that needs to be addressed. And the problem needs to be addressed fast, efficiently, and effectively, so we're not trying to make these changes 50 years from now, because people are dying. People are literally dying. So we want to make these changes more effective and not wait for them to happen 50 years. I mean, obviously we want to be better off 50 years from now, but we want to be better off 1 day from now, 1 month from now, 1 year from now. So how do we make it more effective? So that's why we need to understand the process of behavior change. So coming back to the individual level of behavior change, pain happens, we get motivated. 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 1 month later, 6 months later, 1 year later, what happens? We return to the status quo. And nothing changes. So let's look at what's happening on the collective now. What happened to George Floyd this is not the first time that's happened. So we get rage. We rise up in defiance of injustice, in defiance of brutality, in defiance of racism, in defiance of tyranny. We rise up, which is a beautiful thing that we're rising up. But how do we make sure it stays? How do we make sure that 2 weeks from now, the next thing happens in the news and nothing changes, and then 3 weeks later, 1 month later, 2 weeks later, whatever time frame, this kind of thing happens again? Because again, what happened to George Floyd was not the first time this has happened. So it's not just about getting, we rise up in because some pain happens and then we want to change, we get motivated for a minute, and then things go back to the old status quo. That is not what we need here. So what is the fight what is the thing we need to combat then? What is the thing we need to combat? Obviously, yes, racism, but racism is the symptom of something deeper. Now, when I look at it from my own experience and from the research in the nature of human conflict and violence, the core reason, the root of all conflict is the sense of otherness. We create a sense of otherness that this person, this black man or whoever it may be, this person is another. They are other than me, and because they are other, they are less than. When we deem somebody other, we are now deeming them less than, and not even just less than, but history has shown we don't even just deem them less than, but we deem them as not even human. And by deeming them subhuman, dehumanizing them completely, we justify to ourselves, to the world, acts of violence against this other. Now, to be very clear, and this is really important, other does not mean otherness and differences are two different things. I've seen sometimes people say, I don't see color. Nonsense. Color can exist. I'm a brown dude, you're a black dude, white dude, Asian, there's all kinds of different differences. My buddy who was in this house working out with me a couple hours ago, he's a white dude, I'm a brown dude. We can see the differences and see that above the differences, above that one area, obviously being brown and white is just one area of differences, there's plenty of others, but above those differences, there's a oneness. There's a oneness in the human family. There's a oneness in the human condition. There's a oneness in acknowledging our collective humanity. Now, anybody watching this, anybody who knows me, who's aligned with this, we're going to agree in the oneness of all that is, a oneness of humanity, a oneness of the human family. But again, what do we do about it, right? So combating otherness, not differences, but combating otherness is how we reduce, how we eliminate these destructive forces of racism, of violence, of injustice, of man's inhumanity to man. Otherness is the fight we are fighting for, is combating that. And to do that, we need to implement behavior change. We need to figure out the process of behavior change in order to eliminate otherness. So let's come back to the individual analogy of behavior change. Now, obviously, we need to take sustained action in order to create behavior change. There's a lot into that, but I'm going to talk about the foundation of it, which is awareness. Awareness is self-awareness is the foundation for all. Awareness over the problems, awareness over our own triggers. I had to understand what are the triggers that led me to drinking. I had to go into those dark spaces I was refusing to confront, my own survivor's guilt from the war and all those spaces. So awareness of the darkness, awareness of the patterns, awareness of the beliefs, and awareness of the paradigms, the mental models, and awareness of how we view the world that is leading to said behavior we want to change. Now, let's once again bring this to the collective. It's not just awareness of racism. We all know that racism exists, although I've actually seen people argue that racism isn't real. I mean, it's baffling, so let's not even go down that nonsense road. We all know racism exists. So awareness of not just racism, but of the forces that allow one to deem somebody as another, which has led to the symptom of racism. because the core of the racism battle is otherness and awareness of what is it that has somebody perceive as someone as the other. Now, I'm going to share a lot more in this article that I'm working on, but I want to at least share one story and offer potentially just a small little, tiny little action step just to get us moving in the right direction of combating otherness. Fantastic story of Daryl Davis, a black man who went into KKK rallies, who went and looked to understand what would have somebody hate him. He experienced, when he was a young kid, he experienced an act of racism and wanted to understand, how is it that somebody could hate him without knowing him? How is it that somebody could hate another simply for the color of their skin? So he went in, and he single-handedly is responsible for getting 200 people out of the KKK. It's an incredible, incredible story. He's a truly just incredible human being. 200 people got out of the KKK. So when he went in there, he didn't go in there ready to go to war, ready to go to battle. He went in there to understand the ideology that had led somebody to believe, that had the patterns, the experiences, the lens of the world, the belief systems that had led somebody to align with the ideology of the KKK. He started by becoming friends. This story is incredible. I'll link to it. He became friends with people in the KKK in order to understand their ideology. And by doing so, there's, again, a lot more to the story. I'm going to share more in this article I'm working on. But he helped get 200 people out of the KKK by attempting to understand the other, by attempting to become aware of the mentality of the other, the belief of the other, by going into those dark spaces. So I hope you can see the analogy of the individual behavior change applying to the lens of the collective behavior change. Becoming aware of the other, approaching with curiosity, with understanding, not with judgment, not with ready to go to war. And believe me, this is not easy. And I want to be also clear about one thing real quick, is that this is not to say justice should not be served. This is not to say that someone like Derek Chauvin should not be charged for murder. Of course he should be. Like, what he did was murder and he needs to be charged for it. There needs to be justice served. But the point is awareness of, more importantly, because look, you put an end to one man who committed one act of racism, one act of violence, one act of injustice, is not solving the problem. What happened to George Floyd is not the first time this has happened. So it's not about just one man. It's about addressing this, the consciousness that created the mentality of that one man. And Daryl Davis is a fantastic example of that, of going into the KKK to understand them from the lens of curiosity. And by doing so, he eliminated otherness and got 200 people out of the KKK. Now, there's plenty more examples where this came from, and I'm going to share more in the article. But just as a step in the right direction, because what's been ironic is seeing people who, on the one hand, will stand fight against racism, and yet, on the other hand, demonize somebody else and judge somebody else who basically applying otherness in another context. It might not be in a race context, but we're now applying otherness in another context. And by doing so, we're displaying the very same core forces, the very same real thing that we need to combat that leads to the symptom of racism. So I might say racism is bad, but then what I will do is I'll go show otherness by deeming X person stupid for his point of view, instead of saying, okay, let me understand why X person has that point of view, instead of deeming them stupid. Because by calling them stupid, by saying that person is not me, I'm not like them, all we are doing is applying otherness in a different context. Not going to change anything ultimately. Yeah, it might not stop that one person who is truly anti-racist. Get it, right? They're truly anti-racist, but the otherness is the real core. Otherness is the real battle that needs to be fought. So I'm going to go more into the science of behavior change and the process of behavior change and applying it at the collective with some profoundly beautiful examples like Daryl Davis. But for now, my invitation is go out there and practice understanding someone you have deemed another. Whether it be consciously, subconsciously, we all do this. Look, I'm at fault for deeming otherness in another context. I know from the core of my soul it's not in racism, but like in other contexts, I'll judge somebody and be like, and I'll do that. And so now I'm saying is looking at within ourselves is, where do we display otherness? Where do we see someone as otherness? And go out and understand. Look at any lens. For right now, let's look at any lens. Just apply it in one lens, whether it be race, religion, nationality, sex, some form of difference that has been created that you now deem an other. Instead of judging, instead of showing hatred, show some understanding. Go talk to this person who is another in whatever lens you have chosen. Go talk to them. Understand them. Try to get a sense of what their worldview has led them to X force, whether you pick religion, race, nationality, whatever it may be. Attempt to understand them. Let's just start there. Let's just start with this one action step, and this article is coming. Until then, I just wanted to share what I think are the battles really here is the process of behavior change and combating otherness. And let's start by doing that, by shedding otherness, by attempting to understand the forces that we deem as other in any context, and just going out there with empathy, with understanding, with curiosity, just as Daryl Davis did, with curiosity, with understanding to really figure out what is it that led to the other. Let's start there and we'll work from there.